I read Mind of My Mind by Octavia Butler. This is a reread for me. It's a science fiction book in the Patternist series, which I've read Pattern Master, Clay's Arc, and now this book. And I'm going to be talking about the connections between those three books. And this is a reverse reading order, but it's closer to the published order of the books originally. And so Octavia Butler's first published book ever was The Pattern Master. And this book serves as kind of a prequel in that way, explaining how the Patternist Society originated. And so the way that the books are presented now is kind of a chronological order within the series. But I think reading them in the order that they were published gives a different tone to the books and reveals something a little bit different about them than reading them in chronological order. And so I've read these books many, many times, and so this is just a different way to think about them. So Mind of My Mind is set in the 20th century. So this is further back in time. The Patternist series is like several centuries in the future. Clay's Arc was 100 or maybe 150 years in the future. And so this is more contemporary. When Octavia Butler is writing this in the 1970s, it's pretty much like present day kind of fiction. It's set in Los Angeles, and we get a view of Los Angeles that centers on lower income people and the poorer communities, and especially, I think, focuses in on themes of mental illness and abuse and the ways in which those are kind of systemic and are contributing, or maybe the root cause of the poverty of the characters. The main character in the book is named Mary, and the story is about how she becomes the first pattern master or establishes the pattern for the first time. And so I would guess that, this isn't in the story, but I guess after this, one of her kids or maybe somebody else that they end up finding through the pattern inherits the pattern after Mary dies, because none of the characters from this book appear in any of the other, in the Pattern Master. So they must all be dead. And the reason that I say that is because we see a bunch of characters in this book who have been alive for a very, very long time, like thousands of years, some of them. And so it seems like the mortality of the characters becomes more acute after the creation of the pattern. So there's no more immortals after this point in the history of the novels. When the story starts, there's a prologue that introduces us to the two immortal characters that I mentioned. So there's Doro, who is kind of, I guess, a man, although his special ability that he has, all of these are like the psychic mutants that we met in the Pattern Master book. So they all have individual special psychic talents, and his talent is the ability to have his mind take over and destroy the mind of another person, and then he controls their body after that. And then the other character who is kind of immortal is Emma, and she has a almost kind of opposite ability where she is able to fully control her body in any way that she wants. And so when we meet her, she's like a old grandmother. Her hands are all gnarled. Her face is wrinkly. Her body is old and flabby. And then during the scene where the characters are talking to each other, she reshapes her body to be young and beautiful and supple. And then it talks about later that she's also like incredibly strong, like superhumanly strong and other things. So like she's a shapeshifter, I guess, but she basically can heal any illness and get rid of any of the internal effects of aging. So she's basically immortal, like nothing could kill her unless she, I don't know, like some kind of disaster or something. She fell into a volcano or something. But other than that, like she's pretty indestructible. And these characters kind of have a little discussion that talks about, it kind of establishes power dynamics between the two of them. So they are in a way married to each other. And it seems like that's because they don't have anybody else in the world who is like them. And I wouldn't call their relationship like loving and close. They're not married in that way. It just seems like no one else can understand or be a companion to them. And so they just like kind of have each other. And Doro has this plan for Mary, and he comes to talk to Emma about it and basically gives Emma some orders about like, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And then she's like, why don't you ask me? Like, that would be better if you were not a jerk about it. And this shows us something about their characters, that Doro expects everybody to obey him all the time. He is kind of a dictator, but he's also interested in genetic breeding of humans. This is his main project. And it's not clear if like Doro at this point is a human. Like there's something really alien about him. At one point, he kind of refers to himself as a ghost. And I think it taps back into those themes that I talked about in Clay's arc that have to do with mind versus body and our conception in the West of like Cartesian metaphysics, where you're kind of like, I think, therefore I am. And so who you are at your core is your mind, and your body does not necessarily play a part in that. And so we see when Doro first meets up with Emma and sits down, as soon as he starts talking, she knows that it is Doro. She's able to recognize him through his speech and not necessarily his body. And so the core part of Doro's identity exists in his mind. That is the identity that his followers and the people who know him can identify about him. And so this book really, I think, asserts the mind over body connection. But I think, well, you know, like ostensibly you look at Doro and you'd be like, that has to be the way that the metaphysics of this world and the patternnists work. But I think there's something more subtle happening in the book that really troubles that idea. And it has to do with that mental dysfunction that I talked about that's contributing to the poverty, especially of the Los Angeles area, which seems filled with the descendants of the people that Doro has been controlling the breeding of over time. And so all of their mental anguish has to do with the fact that they have these mutant powers where they have like latent psychic abilities to pick up on the pain and suffering of everyone around them. And so that makes them filled with like the anguish of their community, and they're like highly dysfunctional because of it. So they try to run away from all of the pain and everything by indulging in drugs or pouring it out on other people in the form of abuse. All of them are really bad at dealing with children because of the strong emotions that children have. And at the same time, they're all drawn to each other. They need to be close to each other. They don't understand why. And that means that they all feed on each other's pain. And so, you know, like when one of them is having some kind of crazy psychic episode, that bleeds over into the other people, who then bleed over into the other people. And it just like has a compounding effect that makes everything worse. And I bring all that up to say that I think there's a biological component there, that Doro has deliberately bred these people in ways that they are averse to. They don't want to be with this person or that person. They don't want to raise their children. So there's like a strong push against that in their own biology, but he forces them into it. And then the result of that is all of the dysfunction that I mentioned. It's biological. So that biologically, they're pulling in all of the pain around them. Biologically, they need to be close to each other for reasons that they don't understand. And then if they do have a controllable psychic ability, then they have like a kind of disposition to using that without anyone having to teach them how their powers work. And so they kind of like, it's almost teleological, the way that they're able to naturally or just like through their biology know how to do the thing that they're doing. And they could get better at it with practice and by thinking about it. But for the most part, they do it unconsciously. So that all has to do with the ways in which their bodies or their biology is kind of commanding their personality or their mind or their essence. And I think something similar is happening with Doro, because when we meet Mary and we get to know her, and we, especially once we get into the part of the book that has the pattern, we find out that all of those powers lead her to make certain choices and have certain types of behavior that are the same as Doro. And so her abilities, which lie in her genetics and her body, are kind of commanding her to behave in certain ways. And they're the same ways as Doro. And so therefore, I guess this is my claim, there's this subtle aspect to the book that maybe Doro's body, when he was a 13-year-old boy and lost it, was giving him the same kind of directions and impulses and guidance that Mary's body does now. It's just that because all that's left of him is his mind, our read on it is that it's more Cartesian, that it's mind over body. But really his entire personality was shaped by his body first, and now all that's left of that body is the mind. So that's kind of the subtle thing that I think is happening in the book, that the body has more of a participation in who the person is than our culture is necessarily comfortable with. And a lot of the book, I think, is about that, the interplay between body and mind and the degree to which we are comfortable with how that works. We want to believe that the most vital essence of who we are is our mind, but and don't want to acknowledge the ways in which our body affects our mind. And a lot of the horror in the book comes from that relationship. So later, when Mary is using the pattern to kind of quote unquote heal people and have them go through their transition into their psychic powers, that is a kind of change in their body that allows their mind to land in a more healthy place afterwards. So she's not changing their mind. She's freeing the torture in the body so that the mind can become more clear, I guess is the claim that I'm making. So by reading it in reverse, I think you could just see the ways in which the pattern controlled people in Pattern Master, the ways that biology controlled the Clayarchers in Clay's Arc. All of those themes are present here in Mind of My Mind, but they're much more subtle. And I find this book way more relatable than the previous two, easier to sink into. And maybe that has something to do with the more contemporary setting. It's almost like an urban fantasy or something. The way that there's this entire secret kind of psychic world underneath the surface that most Americans aren't aware of because it's happening first amongst mostly Black people, but especially amongst poor people. And then the ways that the psychic people kind of cover their tracks and just erase the awareness of people who don't have psychic abilities at all so that they can't be perceived or tracked down by the government authorities and stuff. And so it's just in the exact way that in urban fantasy, the fantastical elements are hidden from the wider culture, and so everything is a secret. That's kind of how Doro's world operates. Everything is hidden from the larger American culture. But I think it's also a kind of metaphor for the darker side of America, if you will, the side of America that when the Constitution is written says that Black people equal only 3/5 of a person, and the large part of the American South has to do with a deliberate breeding program that is trying to take Black people's bodies and reproduce them as a form of free labor and power, and trying to breed the perfect servants, whether those servants be in the house or out in the farm field. The same way that we breed animals and seeing an equivalent there. That is how Doro treats his people. And he doesn't care about their suffering. He doesn't care about their desires. He requires complete obedience all the time, or he meets it with utter violence that has to do with an implacable death. He will just kill you if you don't do what he says. And the things that he tells people to do is, you are going to get married to this person and have babies with them, or you're going to get this person pregnant, or you're going to get pregnant by this person. Because the whole thing is like a breeding program to him. And we'll get more into the reasons of why that's happening. But I do think that there's something there that Butler is pointing to the legacy of the American South and the project of chattel slavery, the ways in which Black people were bred by white people to be servants. Doro often appears in the bodies of white people, but also it kind of shows a way in which that project was happening, but simultaneous to it was, the reasons that project was happening was a belief that white people are superior to Black people and therefore have the right to do this. But with these psychic powers and the ways in which the powers are used in this book to create a group of slaves who, by the way, are mostly white, I think it shows that there's an inversion in the story of the kind of narrative that was being delivered with white supremacy. And so Doro is actually creating a superior type of person through his breeding program who is built to rule over others in the exact way that we see in the Pattern Master book. And so there's a way in which Doro is creating an actual master race who exists for the purposes of making slaves of everyone who is not a member of that race. And so again, the way that I talked about in Pattern Master, there is this element of actual manifestation of race theory, that there are these literal different races, and the kind of nightmare that would make out of human society if it was really true. And so Butler is again posing that question of, what if race theory was actually true? It doesn't create a kind of utopian society the way that the American society was kind of imagined to fit according to the dictates of nature, and then kind of maximize the flourishing of everything by going with the flow of nature and kind of maximizing the outcomes that go with that flow. That was the idea. And so people believe that, white people are superior to Black people, so we'll just go along with that and kind of maximize the outcomes. That didn't work because it's not actually natural. Well, now this is natural. It is natural that these psychic people should rule over people who are not psychic. That is what their bodies tell them to do. That is what they are built to do. and the outcome of that, it's a nightmare. So that's kind of the allegory that Butler is building in the book, I think. So anyway, to sink back into the story, because all I've talked about is the prologue. So we meet Mary in the first chapter, and she's a young teenager, and has her mother, who is not a very good mother. Because of all these things that I've said, she has these latent psychic powers, which make her pick up on all the pain of people around her. And then she takes out that pain on her daughter and also on various boyfriends that she picks up, both because they provide like a kind of psychic distraction, but also because they can be victims for her violence. And so she has this very dysfunctional family, but because she is reaching puberty, this is around the time that the psychic transition happens. So there's a change in the body where they go from being a regular person who doesn't have any abilities to whatever it is that their specialized psychic ability is going to be. So Mary is right on the cusp of this change, and Doro steps in and says, from now on, you're going to live with my wife, Emma, and then explains to her that he's going to marry her off to a man and be like, this is your husband now, and you're going to have babies with him, because he is the most controlled and powerful psychic that Doro has. And so that guy is going to help her through her transition period so that she doesn't get hurt or die during the process, which is something that happens to a lot of Doro's psychics. And so you can see there's like a lot of suffering in this community, and Doro doesn't really seem to care about it at all. Mary is very upset by this news that she's going to be moved out of her house and that she's going to be forced to marry somebody, and that, you know, this transition, which is really, really scary, is coming up. And she cares about Doro, like she's understood who Doro is for her entire life and that there's something special about her. But she always thought that she would get married to Doro directly, and then whatever the special thing is, like she would live out her life or maybe even be immortal in the ways that he is. And so she's having to reckon with, you know, reality, basically, that like Doro doesn't have any favorites. He doesn't actually care about people in the ways that she wants to be cared about, and that she doesn't get to have choices in this whole thing because Doro's a dictator and you have to do what he says or he'll kill you. And so she goes off and gets married and starts to do her transition, and her husband helps her out with it. And it's extremely difficult for her. She's picking up on all kinds of pain and suffering around her. There's like people who there's like a guy who gets hit by a car, and she picks up the very moment that happens. And she's so strongly connected psychically to her husband that she draws him into it as well, which is unusual. And just on and on like that, just all kinds of like whatever, you know, children getting beaten, terrible things happening to people. And she is drawn into their suffering because suffering is more psychically loud than any other experience. And so those are the things that she's kind of quote unquote hearing first. But her husband helps her to make the transition possible. And when she pulls through, what she finds and what her husband finds is that she has somehow linked with him in a way where he doesn't have full control over his body and powers anymore. And so he really hates this. Like it makes him very angry and upset. And he demands that she release him from whatever this is. And she doesn't even understand what it is. And she finds that she's not able to let him go. And that in any case, she doesn't want to let him go. And this gets back to the whole thing that I said about the the biology of it, that this is what her power is. She has an intuitive understanding to make networks of power between individuals. And so she's made this psychic connection between her and her husband, where she's the more powerful and dominant of the pair in the network. And she has full access to his mind and emotions. She can just like read everything about him, but he can't read anything about her. And she's also directly tied into kind of his vital life force in his body and is drawing energy from him at the same time. But he can't draw energy from her or control her at all. And so there's a real like kind of master and slave relationship that's happening with this psychic link. And I think it's mirrored in the way that when we first meet her husband, he has a woman who has no psychic powers that he's living with, that he kind of refers to as his wife. And he's like brainwashed her. He's like programmed her mind to be completely in love with him and attend to his every need. And she doesn't really have like a personality of her own. And it's like a really sick relationship where he's like mind raped this woman to force her to be with him and love him. And then as soon as Mary makes this connection after her powers manifest, he throws a huge tantrum about her having this level of control over him, even though she's not doing anything with it, and doesn't see the ways in which this makes him a hypocrite. That, you know, she has this control over him, but doesn't do anything with it. He has this control over everybody who doesn't have psychic powers and uses it to like make a woman be in love with him and have sex with him all the time. So the ways in which people are using power in this story says a lot about, I think, Butler's view of human appetites, the way that power can corrupt, the way that a lack of consequences allows people to go too far and to become depraved and exploitative of the other people around them. Because what happens right away after her transition is done is that she reaches out to several other psychics who are also have gone through transition and are very powerful. And almost every one of them is exploiting regular non-psychic people in similar ways. And so one of the people that we meet, her name is Rachel, and she's like healer. She's able to, like the kind of healer that we met in the Pattern Master in the character Amber. She's able to, with her mind and psychic powers, reach into people and heal whatever is wrong with them, or like help to regrow limbs, things that would be medically impossible for the most part, she's able to do with her mind. And this seems related to the ability that Emma, the grandmother character, has, where she can affect her own body psychically. She can, you know, she doesn't age and things like that. This is what Rachel is doing for other people. But the way that she presents herself is as a faith healer in churches, and she kind of has the people worship her, and she forms a connection with the congregation where she takes their psychic energy, their life force, whatever, and channels it into herself, and then uses that energy that she channeled out of them to achieve the healings on the bodies of the sick people who she heals. And so there's a kind of vampiric relationship between Rachel and the non-psychic people. And even though she's providing this valuable service of curing incurable things, she's doing it by preying on the essence of the people involved. And so there's an exploitation that's happening in the use of power. And in the same way, when Mary makes the connection with Rachel and kind of, I think she's in New York or something, and it forces Mary to travel across the country from New York to Los Angeles and meet up with her in her house. She's extremely resentful that she had this impulse, that she is drawn away from what she wants to do. It takes away her freedom. It's taking away her life energy. She can feel that one-way connection with Mary because she's very used to that from the way that her powers work. And so she's extremely resentful of the entire situation. But again, it's kind of hypocritical because that is the situation that she's been doing to people all along. And there's no kind of reflection on this. Like, nobody in the story is ever like, oh man, I was a really bad person when I was doing this stuff. It's all very natural. Again, I think there's something about it that's in their bodies, and that they just like, this is the way that I am. And that is controlling the perceptions of their mind in terms of like what's right and what's wrong. And there's a lack of empathy, which I think is a really big theme throughout these books. And I talked about that in Pattern Master, the way that Amber's way of dealing with people is more communal, it's more empathetic. And there's some of that in this story as well. But that lack of reflection, that lack of ability to see the hypocrisy in the behavior, I think speaks to a way that the characters either are not able or not willing to see things from the perspective of the characters who don't have psychic powers, the people who are their victims. They just don't see them as people in the same way that they are, and don't care about like their suffering in the way that they're basically suffering in the exact same way when they come under Mary's pattern. Doro, when he finds out about the pattern and what's going on, seems pretty satisfied with this outcome. It seems like this is exactly the kind of thing that he was aiming for. He believes that he was going to be something like what Mary was when his transition happened, except that he didn't have anybody there to help him with it, and he died. But in dying, his consciousness made this connection with his mother because she was holding him during his sickness of going through transition. And so that close proximity, that physical contact allowed him to make the same kind of connection between Mary and her husband. It seems to me like this is what happened. It's not super explicit in the book, but this is how it seems to me. So he made a connection with his mother where, there's the whole thing of like their life force is connected. She can't draw on him, but he can draw on her. And just by instinct, without meaning to, just following the pathways of power and the way that his abilities work and kind of the intuition of his body, he completely drains his mother of her life force and snuffs out her mind. And then his mind moves out of his unhealthy dying body and into her healthy, vital body. And the surprise is so jarring and traumatic, because basically he just murdered his mother. But it also made him feel euphoric and good, which is an experience that Mary has when she's drawing on the life force of people in the pattern. She says it makes her feel high. And so Doro felt this good feeling, but it was associated with the bad feeling of murdering his mother and also his body dying. It's all so surprising and overwhelming that he immediately does the same thing to his father, who is very, very close nearby, and jumps from the mother's body into the father's body, destroys his father's mind, and takes over that body. And then from that point on, that's how Doro exists. He's not able to actually die. Whenever the body dies, He just moves to the nearest body and consumes their mind. And he finds that this euphoric feeling that he feels has a better savor to it, or the whole transition is able to last longer, is more satisfying, if the person that he is consuming, quote unquote, has psychic powers or like latent abilities. And so in the same way that Mary is able to draw power from these psychic people in her pattern, that is the same source of food, if you will, for Doro. And so now Mary is able to do the thing that Doro believes he was made to do. So Doro is kind of like recreated himself. He kind of fixed what he was supposed to be. So if Doro had been born now, he would have a community to step into, an infrastructure, a race is what he calls it, that will begin an empire that will make the world a better place for people like him. No one ever has to die again the way that he did and become the kind of ghost-like monster that he is, because now he has successfully created Mary. At the same time, this means that Mary is kind of like a peer to him, and also that she needs or uses the same food source that he does. And so now she is his competitor instead of someone that he can just order around. And that's a situation that he hasn't had to deal with basically ever. And he's 4,000 years old. He's used to being an absolute dictator and no one can resist him. But now Mary exists in this incredibly important role, and she's the only pattern master that he's been able to engineer in these 4,000 years. So she's not just incredibly rare, she's totally irreplaceable. And at the same time, she's competing with him for the resources that he needs. So this switches things in the story from Doro being this kind of malevolent presence, but who is an ally and a mentor, to a direct antagonist. He is going to work against the goals and interests of Mary for the rest of the story after this point. And so Mary has drawn several psychics to her, and they all live in the house that her husband had, which he kind of stole from somebody by reprogramming their mind with his psychic powers, which he doesn't see as abusive or exploitative or bad. He just like, yeah, I just wanted this house, so I took it. And that is kind of the way that these people all end up living together. They live in this house, but they also start to kind of take over the surrounding community. They start buying up the property or having it deeded over to them by reprogramming the minds of people. And then Mary seeks out people who have latent abilities like her mother did or other people in the community, but never successfully transition to actually have psychic powers. So they just kind of languish in suffering and like picking up all the pain around them, but never have a power or learn how to block out all of the psychic noise from the community. So she takes these people in. This is instinctive on her part. She just feels like this is something she should do. So she creates a pattern bond between her and this person, and then draws them into their community and kind of takes energy from everybody else in the pattern and feeds it into the individual who has latent abilities. And this triggers their transition. And then she's able to help them through the transition more successfully because of the pattern. And it manifests their abilities for the first time and blocks out all the communal pain that's going on. And so this kind of shows the ways in which the pattern is beneficial to the people who are members of it, and the way that it builds a community that understands the needs and mitigates the suffering of its members. So Doro has been building a community for thousands of years that are both kind of slaves of his, but also food for him. And he doesn't care very much about the suffering of any of the individuals in the community and the ways in which that suffering is like transmitted to the larger human society. So like the ways in which crime is rampant in Los Angeles and pollution and all kinds of bad things. He doesn't care about that and the way that his group of people is contributing to that. So Mary is building a very intentional community that is getting rid of suffering, that is bringing order into people's lives, that's giving them a job to do. It's giving them, it's taking their kids and putting them into really good schools to be raised by people who are better at taking care of them because they're not picking up all of the strong psychic emanations coming from the children and being debilitated by them the way that the Laytons were, the way that her mother was, and being like her mother was abusive to her in ways that her mother couldn't really help because that's how the psychic resonance worked between the adult and the child. This way, they're able to take regular people from the community, reprogram their minds to have them raise the children in a healthier environment, help those children through their psychic transition, and make them productive members of the pattern. And at the same time, draw in people who are not contributing to the wider community, who are suffering themselves because of their ailment, and completely inverting that entire experience for them. So now they are important members of the community who are contributing, who are able to do their own projects and come up with their own reasons for living. And so all of that is kind of positive and utopian in a way. It's the realization of the kind of empire that Doro wants to build. But again, Mary is at the head of the entire project. She's the one who's in control, not Doro. At the same time, this forces like a lot of slavery to happen in terms of the regular people who are falling victim to the psychic abilities of this growing patternist community. And they call the people who don't have powers mutes. And we saw that in the Pattern Master book, that regular people are just called mutes. And at one point, Emma talks about this in the ways in which it reminded her of slavery in the Deep South and the way that white people talked about Black people. That they're talking about these people as if they are not humans at all, that they are just a convenient thing that serves them in whatever capacity they need. And they think that it's okay because they just program out suffering and add in like happiness and satisfaction. And so they just make it so that the person feels a deep satisfaction with being the house slave of the psychic person and never wanting to have their freedom or caring about, all the connections with other people they had and the goals that they had for their life. Just all that stuff is gone, and all of their happiness comes from being a slave. And they consider that to be more humane than, just forcing them to be a slave the way that people were in the Old South, Black people were in the Old South. And so, obviously, this is terrible and dystopian, but I think that is what Butler does. She mixes together these different elements of here's a society that's building all of these good things, that's kind of correcting these mistakes that were happening. These unintended consequences of Doro's community building are being worked out by Mary, but it's creating a whole different kind of oppression. It's really taking the oppression that existed in other contexts and channeling it into this new society. And I think you can see the ways in which this sets the table for the kind of violence and everything that we saw in Clay's arc in the society that had collapsed under the American government, and the ways that that was almost like a Mad Max type of lawless communities that were sadistic and hyper violent. And we talked about like what things were like in Los Angeles during that time, and how, a family on a road trip was traveling with a fully automatic, extremely powerful weapon, and thinking that that was perfectly normal, and that it was normal to maybe be kidnapped and held for ransom, that their family would pay for them. The kind of suffering and exploitation that's happening in this version of Los Angeles 100 years earlier is showing, how things are going to get to that degenerated state. And I think Butler does such a good job of having us like Mary, for having us root for her, and making us complicit in the project of her community building. Like when you compare Mary to Doro, Doro is very much of a dictator. Mary feels much more of a community organizer. She's really like solving problems. She seems to care a lot about the individual experiences of people. She has a lot of empathy, but at the same time, she sees the necessity of having this support structure of people who basically they're just slaves. She says it herself that there's no way that the pattern can work without having the mutes be part of the system. And so she's just like reconciled to the fact that they make slaves out of people. And when Emma talks about this, I think she kind of points out correctly the thing that I'm saying about the biological drive of the whole thing. That Mary is not completely driven by her empathy or by her desire to make the community better. That those might be post hoc rationalizations for drives that are deeper in her biology that are creating the conditions of her mind. So she has this deep need to create the pattern and grow the pattern, and therefore she needs the infrastructure of support that the mutes provide, and everything after that need being fulfilled is just kind of a rationalization where she can just say like, well, I'm making things better for everybody in the community. I'm taking these people who would suffer and die without our help and giving them purpose and helping them to become powerful psychics. Like that's all a good thing. When the truth is, the actual thing that she's trying to do is grow this pattern, because the pattern feeds her life source. It is the thing that she is made to do psychically. And so she's just kind of, what she's really doing is playing out her biology, in other words. She's participating in the kind of race creation that Doro has built her to do, and then rationalizing things afterwards to sound moral and good to herself. And so again, I think there's something about the relationship between mind and body that Butler is exploring and is more scary and uncomfortable for our society, because we don't like to think of our bodies as anything other than vehicles for our minds. But Butler is kind of forcing in the narrative a confrontation in the ways in which our bodies actually shape our minds, and that our minds then turn around and rationalize and kind of erase the body's influence over itself and try to make the mind primary to the body. But that is an issue of control. Which one is really in control? Is it the mind or the body? And I think this plays out in the actual plot of the book, because as we reach the climax of the book, Doro decides, after having some conversations with Emma, like I just mentioned, that basically Mary has reached a point where she's getting too powerful. She's going to get out of his control, and he's not comfortable with that. She might get to a point where she will try to confront him directly, and that's going to really mess up his wider project. And so he needs to scare her and stop her, slow her down. So he goes to her and commands her to stop growing the pattern, that she's going to wait until she has some children and those children are fully grown and they would be able to take over the pattern if she died. And presumably Doro would be involved in their lives in certain ways so that he could groom them to make them better at being his servants and following his goals instead of Mary's goals. So this would be like a way to undermine the ways in which she's not doing the things that Doro wants and have him take control back of the community. Mary is not interested in this. She's very upset by this. She doesn't like it. And so she wants to fight back. And what ends up happening, of course, is a confrontation between Mary and Doro that I think is a confrontation between mind and body, where Mary is the body and Doro is the mind. And up to this point, like, Mary has kind of stepped inside of Doro's psychic grip before this and found that he's vastly more powerful than her, that he would easily be able to destroy her, to consume her essence and take over her body the way that he's been doing for thousands of years. But by using the entire life force of the pattern and having everybody be willing to contribute their energies to getting rid of Doro, they're able to draw him into the energy of the pattern itself and kind of like disperse him along the network and then consume what's left of him after that. And so it's as if they kind of like shove the ghost into a body and then like kill the body, kind of a thing. So the body overwhelms the mind. I think this is like a very deliberate choice on Butler's part, it seems to me. That Doro is the mind, Mary is the body, and the body is stronger than the mind. And it's the biological imperatives being followed and then rationalized by the mind that are the preconditions necessary for the kind of nightmare future that we've read in Pattern Master and Clay's Arc. Because in Clay's Arc, that is a whole story about how biology takes over the mind. And in Pattern Master, it was the way in which the system of power, the pattern itself, had more control over people than their individual will did. Whatever you decided mattered a lot less than the position that the pattern had for you, even for the people at the very top of the pattern. So there was no real privileged position within the pattern. There was just a system of slavery that even enslaved the slave master. So there's a capturing of the individual by their biology when there's this creation of a master race in actual fact. So the kind of dream of the white supremacist that there is a master race, Octavia Butler shows the way in which that dream is a nightmare, because the biological imperative of it would rob every individual in the system of their actual freedom. There's no liberty in a system that requires slavery and supremacy for anybody, either the supremacist or the slave. I like the way that the construction of this story is kind of a reinterpretation of the Pattern Master. You have the confrontation between the child and the father. That's the same in both books. There's the important character of the healer. You had Amber and Rachel, and the way that they teach the main character their healing ability, the power of empathy, and the insights that gives in terms of control for the main character, both for Teray and for Mary. But the ways that empathy shows itself to be an alternative path, another way to wield power and build community, but also the ways in which the structure of power itself thwarts that empathetic path, because supremacy more closely fits to the nature of this kind of power than the lateral empathy where everybody has equal agency within the community structure. That's not the way that the pattern works intrinsically. There is no lateral motion. Everything is vertical and hierarchical. There's no way for Mary to redistribute power equally because the pattern doesn't work that way. She is at the top of the pattern and everyone is beneath her, and everyone has people who are both above and beneath them. There's not a whole lot of lateral positions within the structure. And for that reason, it resists empathy. Empathy instead becomes a tool that can be used to exploit people within the structure instead of the cure for that exploitation. I think that's a really fascinating insight on Butler's part, that what we perceive in our free society to, like empathy, justice, and these kind of things are actually tools in the hands of supremacists, and that we need to be more wary about the deployment of empathy, insight, love, and connection, because they're not necessarily the antidote to supremacist powers. They themselves can be tools in the service of hierarchy. And so the next book moves even further back in time and tells the backstory of Doro and Emma, and I think really hones in on that conflict both between mind and body, but also between power and empathy, between healer and wounder, between slave and slave master. In some ways, Wild Seed, the next book, is the most concentrated of all the patternist books in these themes, and maybe the best articulation, at least for me, in the series.